They gave us the end of the world in stages. The way a good executioner works, measured, professional without malice. That's the part that still gets me, lying here in the dark with my knee wrapped and the ship groaning around me like a tired old man. No malice. They didn't hate us. They didn't even notice us, not really, the way you don't notice the ants you flood out when you pour concrete. They simply needed what the planet's deep places had, and we happened to be living on top of it. A clerical error. A scheduling conflict. The end of everything we'd built, and it wasn't even personal. I keep coming back to that. I think I always will. My name is Chief Petty Officer Fred O'Neill. 22 years in the Navy, 11 of them in submarine service. Engine room was my church, the reactor my congregation. I understood machines better than I understood people, which is maybe why I survived and some better men didn't. Machines are honest. They fail in ways you can predict if you're paying attention. They don't decide, halfway through a crisis, to stop caring. People do. People stop and freeze and look for someone else to carry the weight. I've seen it enough times that I stopped being surprised. I've been surprised by the opposite, by the men and women who don't stop, who pick up the weight and carry it past the point where carrying it should be possible. The Dallas had more than her share of those. Let me start there. The USS Dallas was an attack submarine, deep-water configuration, updated sensor suite, the most capable boat in the Northern Fleet according to the briefing documents that nobody had time to finish reading when everything started. She'd been on standard patrol when the first reports came in, nothing unusual on our end, the kind of day where the biggest problem is the coffee situation in the enlisted mess. I was in the engine room doing a scheduled inspection of the secondary coolant loop, which had been running slightly warm for a week, nothing alarming, just a number I wanted to watch. Petty Officer Thompson was in the torpedo room doing an inventory that regulations required quarterly. Lieutenant Rodriguez was in the con, running passive sonar sweeps over a patch of water she'd flagged the previous day, following a thread of acoustic data that she couldn't fully explain and therefore couldn't leave alone. That was Rodriguez. She had a gift that went beyond training, beyond the acoustic databases and the classification algorithms. She heard the ocean the way some people hear music, not note by note but as a whole, as a living thing with moods and textures, and when something was wrong with it, she knew before she could say why. She'd saved the boat twice that way before I came aboard, according to crew scuttlebutt. I believed it. I'd watched her work. Captain Price ran the Dallas the way the best captains do, not through fear, not through the performance of authority, but through the quiet gravity of a man who has been in enough bad situations to know how bad things can get and has decided that knowledge is no reason to panic. He was the kind of officer who remembered your wife's name, your kids' birthdays, the specific way you took your coffee, not because it was a leadership technique, because he actually cared. In the deep water, that distinction matters more than it probably sounds. The seismic reports started coming in on encrypted traffic around 400. I was between the secondary coolant loop and a maintenance log when the first summary hit the comm system, and I put it down to the back of my mind. Major seismic event, Mid-Atlantic. We'd get more information when we got it. By 600, the reports were serious enough that Price called a briefing. The earthquake had registered magnitude 10.4, centered on the Mid-Atlantic ridge. That alone was historic, the kind of event that happened once in a recorded millennium if at all, the kind that rewrote the geological literature and kept seismologists publishing for a decade. But the earthquake, as catastrophic as it was, wasn't what we were focusing on. What we were focusing on was what came after. The thermohaline circulation had stopped. Rodriguez explained it to the assembled crew with the careful precision of someone who had been turning the data over in her mind since 4:30, and had the look of a person who deeply wished they'd reached a different conclusion. The thermohaline circulation, she said, was the planet's heat pump. Deep cold water sinks in the North Atlantic, warm equatorial water flows north to replace it, creating a conveyor belt of ocean current that regulated temperatures across the entire northern hemisphere. Northern Europe's climate habitable far beyond what its latitude should allow, existed because of this system. Eastern Canada, Scandinavia, the British Isles, agricultural zones that fed hundreds of millions of people. The current monitoring stations from the Azores to Iceland were reporting flow rates near zero. Not reduced, not disrupted, near zero. Captain Price waited until Rodriguez finished, then asked the question everyone was thinking: how fast? Rodriguez had already run the models with what data we had. 3 months before northern hemisphere surface temperatures dropped by 10 degrees on average. 6 months before significant ice formation at latitudes that hadn't seen permanent ice since the last glacial period. 1 year before the agricultural disruption became systemic: crop failures, supply chain collapse, infrastructure designed for one climate being asked to function in a fundamentally different one. 5 years, potentially, before stabilization at the new cold state, if it stabilized. The death toll projections she did not share in full. She didn't need to. The numbers in everyone's head were already large enough to be incomprehensible, and incomprehensible is not a useful size for a number when you're trying to work. Price ordered us to maintain position pending further orders and sent an encrypted situation report up the chain. Then he walked back to the con, stood at the plotting table, and looked at the chart for a long time without saying anything. I went back to the engine room. The secondary coolant loop was still running slightly warm. The orders came through 6 hours later. We were to proceed to the rift zone coordinates and conduct a full survey, passive sonar, full spectrum, visual confirmation through the sensor array, report everything we found. The Admiralty was assembling a picture. We were the nearest eyes. We went. The approach took the better part of 14 hours. We ran deep 400 feet, enough to stay clear of the surface chaos that was already developing as shipping routes collapsed, and civilian vessels began ignoring maritime protocols in favor of raw survival instinct. From depth, through the hull, you couldn't hear it, but you could feel it, or I thought you could. The weight of what was happening above us, the scale of it pressing down through 500 feet of water. Rodriguez was at her station for the entire transit. I brought her coffee 3 times and she acknowledged it once, which for her during active work was actually quite warm. The temperature anomaly started registering on our instruments 4 hours from the rift coordinates. Surface temperatures were dropping faster than the models had projected, which was not a comforting data point. But the deeper anomaly was stranger and more troubling. The water below 1,500 feet was running warmer than it should. Not dramatically, 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, but consistently, across a broad area, in a pattern that didn't match any geological explanation in Rodriguez's reference database. She flagged it. Price ordered us deeper. At 2,000 feet, 3 degrees warmer than normal. At 3,005. At 4,000 feet, the sonar showed us something that is still difficult to explain, and that I have given up trying to explain to people who weren't there. The mid-Atlantic ridge in that section of the rift was different. We had the topographical surveys in our database, every mapped feature of the seafloor in that zone, updated from the survey programs of the previous decade. The ridge was not what the database said it should be. Not because of the earthquake, though the earthquake had shifted some of the geological features. The ridge was different because something had been built across sections of it. Structure, regular geometry, repeating patterns, materials that reflected sonar energy in ways that did not occur in any geological formation Rodriguez had ever processed. The reflectivity signatures were dense, layered, complex. The acoustic shadow they cast was enormous. And they were warm. Not warm the way geothermal venting is warm, not the superheated gouts from hydrothermal vent systems, though those were present too. Warm in a distributed way. Across the whole surface of the structures, as if what we were looking at was metabolizing, generating heat from within as a product of whatever processes were occurring inside it. Rodriguez called me from the engine room. I came forward. She said nothing when I arrived. She pointed at the display. I looked at it for a long time. Is it? I started. Yes, she said. We stood there together for a while, two people looking at something that had no precedent in our experience or in any category our training had prepared us for. The sonar display was not made for wonder. It was a tactical instrument, designed to provide targeting data and navigational intelligence. But there was a moment, and I'm not embarrassed to say it, where what I felt was something very close to awe. Not comfortable awe, not the awe of a beautiful thing. The awe of a thing that is very large and very old, and completely indifferent to whether you find it beautiful or not. Then I went back to being an engineer. The structures covered approximately 8 kilometers of the rift zone. They were concentrated at the areas of highest geothermal output, the regions where the planet's internal heat was most accessible, where superheated water rose through the rock in quantities that could sustain something that needed that kind of energy to live. They had been constructed, grown, accreted, built by process rather than by tool, from the mineral-rich water that the vents produced. Silica, sulfur compounds, heavy metals, the chemistry of the deep ocean given form and function by something that understood the materials the way an engineer understands materials. The colony, I started calling it in my head. The colony, because there wasn't another word that fit, and because giving it a name made it possible to work the problem instead of just staring at the display. The colony had sealed significant portions of the rift. Not completely, the venting was still occurring, which was how the colony was surviving, but in ways that disrupted the pressure differentials that drove deep water circulation. The cold, dense water that should have been sinking into the abyss and driving the thermohaline current was instead being deflected, diverted, its flow interrupted by structures that had not been there before the earthquake. The earthquake, we concluded eventually, had cracked open sections of the rift that the colony had then colonized, moved into, grown across, claimed. Whether the earthquake had been caused by colony activity, or had simply created an opportunity the colony exploited, we could not determine. It didn't change the immediate problem. The immediate problem was that 8 kilometers of alien colony growth was killing the planet's thermohaline circulation, and the death of the thermohaline circulation was going to kill a very significant portion of the human population within a period of years that felt uncomfortably specific when Rodriguez said the numbers out loud. We sent everything up in a compressed burst transmission. All the sonar data, all the thermal readings, the acoustic signatures, the structural analysis Rodriguez had been building since we arrived. We flagged it priority 1, and then we waited. The response took 8 hours. I spent part of that time running the math I didn't want to run, because I am an engineer and engineers run the math even when the results are unwelcome. How old was the colony? The mineral accretion rates in deep ocean, hydrothermal environments were documented from scientific surveys, slow in human terms, but the colony's structures showed layering that spoke to geological patience. Conservative estimate, hundreds of years. More likely, thousands. Possibly, and this was the number I set aside because it didn't have operational relevance, much longer than that. Whatever it was, it had been there before the first ship crossed the Atlantic, before anyone on the surface world had the technology to know what lived at 4,000 feet. It had been alive in the deep dark through the entirety of recorded history, through the Roman Empire and the Renaissance and the Industrial Age and the Nuclear Age and everything we'd built and lost and rebuilt on the surface. It had not known any of it. It had not needed to. And now the two of us were in the same water, and the math said only one of us was going to be in the same water for much longer. I went back to the engine room. The secondary coolant loop was still warm. I spent 6 of those 8 hours in the engine room. The secondary coolant loop was still warm, and now I had a theory about why the ambient ocean temperature at our operating depth was elevated, running counter to the surface conditions, and the heat exchangers were working harder to maintain proper reactor cooling. Not dangerous, not even approaching the threshold where I'd need to report it formally, but something to watch. I watched it. My hands needed something to do. Thompson came by midway through the second hour. He was a weapons officer by designation, but had an engineer's mind, methodical, interested in how things worked, the kind of officer who spent his off-watches reading technical manuals for systems that weren't his primary responsibility. He sat on a cable run and watched me work for a while. "You think there's a way to kill it?" he said. "I think there's always a way," I said. "I don't always know what it is yet." "The thing on the rift." "I know what you meant." He was quiet for a while. "It's been there for, what, centuries, before we were doing anything out here." "Longer than that, probably." "So it's not malicious?" "No," I said, "not malicious, just unfortunately placed from our perspective." Thompson thought about that. "Does that change anything?" I set down my instrument and looked at him. "Thompson, 300 million people in the first winter," Rodriguez said. "That was her conservative estimate. Conservative." "I know." "Then no," I said. "It doesn't change anything." He nodded. He went back to the torpedo room. I went back to the heat exchanger. The orders came through at hour 8, read to the full crew by Price over the intercom in his measured, unhurried voice. The voice that said, "This is the information, and now we are going to deal with the information, and panicking is not on the schedule." We were to destroy the colony structures along the primary section of the rift, every asset available. The goal was to break the sealing effect, restore natural venting patterns, and allow the thermohaline circulation to re-establish itself before the window closed. The scientists on the Pentagon crisis team, Dr. Woods and Dr. Johnson, who had been running models since the first reports, had concluded that a sufficiently powerful disruption along a specific critical node would cascade. The colony was interconnected. The structures shared load-bearing function. Destroy one node completely, and the structural failure would propagate to adjacent nodes, which would fail and propagate further, a chain reaction that would clear the primary section of the rift. They had identified the target node. They had transmitted the coordinates. They had also transmitted the probability estimate for the operation. I saw it on the communications printout before Price filed it. 43%. 43% chance of achieving sufficient disruption with the assets available. I did not share this number with anyone else. I don't know if anyone else saw it. We never discussed it. 43% to save the world. You take those odds. You don't love them, but you take them, because the alternative is the certainty of doing nothing. In the hours between receiving the orders and executing them, the Dallas held position at 1,500 feet, running quiet, and I learned something about waiting at depth with the weight of those numbers pressing down. A submarine is a small world. You cannot go for a walk. You cannot stand somewhere and look at the horizon and let the space around you dilute the weight of what you're carrying. You are in the tube, with the same handful of people, and the thing you're thinking about is in the water outside the hull, and it is enormous. I found that people dealt with it in their particular ways. Gupta ran maintenance checks that didn't strictly need running, which was his version of what I was doing in the engine room. Thompson went to the torpedo room and sat with his weapons, and I imagine had a conversation with them that was similar to the one I have with the reactor when I need to think. Danby ate 3 meals in the space of the waiting period, which was not her normal pattern. She cooked things in the small galley that nobody asked her to cook and set them on the mess table, and didn't particularly care whether anyone ate them. She needed her hands busy, and her hands knew how to cook. Rodriguez didn't leave her station. I don't mean that in the metaphorical sense. I mean she physically remained in the con for the entire waiting period, listening to the rift through her instruments, building the most complete acoustic picture of the colony that our sensor suite was capable of producing. She slept once, briefly, in the chair, headphones still on. When I passed through the con on my third coffee run and saw her sleeping that way, I considered waking her, then decided against it. Whatever she was hearing in her sleep was probably more useful data than what she'd get from an hour in her bunk. Price stayed visible. That was the key thing he did during the wait. He stayed in circulation, moving through the boat on no particular schedule, stopping to talk to people about nothing important, asking after things. He sat in the engine room with me for 20 minutes and we talked about the Chesapeake Bay, where he'd grown up, and a particular type of crab trap his uncle had used, and the way the water there had a different texture than deep ocean water, shallower and warmer and full of life you could see from the surface. He didn't tell me everything was going to be all right. He didn't offer false comfort or manufactured certainty. He just sat in the engine room and talked about the Chesapeake, and I let that be enough. I think about that conversation more than I think about the firing sequence. The contact from the surface, when it came updating our orders, included a summary of global conditions that Price read to the crew in full. Cities in Norway and Iceland had lost power in the temperature drop. Agricultural regions in Canada were reporting frost events weeks before seasonal norms. Emergency resource allocations were underway across 12 countries. The word unprecedented was used so many times in the summary that it stopped meaning anything. And yet, reading between the lines of the official language, the crisis team was holding. Dr. Woods and her team were holding. The people whose job it was to think about the problem from the surface were doing that job, running their models, refining their target data, sending us everything they had. They were afraid. You could hear it in the formal precision of the language, the way genuinely frightened people get very precise and very official, but they were working. The least I could do was the same. The problem was the weapons. We carried 8 torpedoes, the standard deepwater attack loadout, updated guidance packages, serious warheads. We did not carry weapons suited for geological targeting, because geological targeting had not previously been a mission category. Everything in our armory had been designed to kill things that moved, that maneuvered, that could be targeted and tracked and destroyed in the conventional military sense. Destroying 8 kilometers of alien colony growth that had been building for centuries, at 4,000 feet of depth, against a material that had been mineralizing and layering for longer than most geological formations. That was a different problem. Rodriguez ran the numbers while Price and I stood at the plotting table and let her work. She had the sonar data, the structural models she'd been building since we arrived, and a set of acoustic propagation tables that were technically classified, but that she had memorized because Rodriguez found classified technical documents relaxing reading. The conclusion she reached was not encouraging. Standard torpedo employment against the target node, maximum warhead proximity detonation, optimal approach angle, would achieve significant damage. It would not achieve structural failure. The colony material in the areas she'd identified as critical nodes was too dense. The shockwave from a torpedo warhead at that depth, in that medium, against that material density, would deliver approximately 60% of the energy necessary to fracture the node sufficiently to trigger cascade. We needed more. We had 8 torpedoes. We could fire all 8 into the same node. The problem was overlap. The first detonation would disturb the water column in ways that affected the guidance precision of subsequent torpedoes, and at that depth, the pressure effects on the warhead fusing systems were already pushing the operational envelope. We might get 60% from the first torpedo and declining returns from each subsequent shot as the water column became increasingly turbulent. What if we change the geometry? I said. Everyone looked at me. The colony isn't uniform density throughout the node. You showed that in the structural model there are gradients, areas of higher and lower mineral concentration. I pointed at the display. The denser areas are harder to fracture but conduct shockwave energy more efficiently once they do crack. The less dense areas are easier to damage but absorb energy. They scatter the shockwave. Rodriguez was nodding slowly. If we damage the less dense material first, the surrounding areas, we change the acoustic medium the subsequent shockwaves travel through. We clear a path. The explosions after the first 2 or 3 have a cleaner route to the critical node because we've removed the material that was absorbing the energy. Reverse the sequence, Rodriguez said. Work from the outside in. Work from the outside in, I confirmed. The colony absorbs the first few shots and we accept that, but each shot changes the geometry in our favor. By the time we're hitting the critical node directly, we've altered the medium enough that the shockwave delivers something closer to full effect. That's not standard torpedo employment, Thompson said. Thompson, I said, not unkindly. Show me in the doctrine manual where it covers alien colony structures on the mid-Atlantic ridge, and I will happily defer to it. Price almost smiled. It was a very small almost. Walk me through the sequence, Chief, all of it. So I walked them through it. It took 4 hours. 4 hours of the most focused, collaborative, problem-solving work I've been part of in 22 years. Every person in that con contributing something essential. Rodriguez handled the acoustic modeling, calculating how each detonation would change the medium for the ones that followed, running the numbers forward through the full sequence. Gupta handled the guidance recalculations. The approach vectors for each torpedo had to account for the altered geometry, the debris field from earlier detonations, the turbulence in the water column. Danby worked the timing. The intervals between shots mattered, giving the water time to partially settle but not so much time that we lost the geometric advantage we were building. Thompson, once he understood the concept, stopped defending orthodoxy and started finding problems in our math that we fixed before they became problems in execution. Price stood at the center of all of it and asked the questions that nobody wanted to ask, the ones that exposed assumptions we hadn't fully examined and weaknesses we needed to address. He didn't pretend to know more than he knew, which is rarer in command than it should be. He knew what he knew, he trusted what we knew, and he held the whole thing together by making sure nobody's piece of the problem got solved in isolation from everyone else's. We lost a guidance system in the 3rd hour. A component in torpedo tube 4 had developed a microfracture, stress-related, almost certainly, probably had been there for a week and would have been caught at the next scheduled maintenance interval. Here now, it meant we couldn't trust the guidance package on that tube. If tube 4 fired and the guidance failed mid-run, the torpedo would not follow its intended path. At best, it would detonate uselessly in open water. At worst was a direction I declined to follow that thought. I pulled the torpedo from tube 4, stripped the guidance package, and spent 40 minutes in a space not much larger than a closet, working by feel and flashlight, rebuilding the guidance connection with components from a backup sensor array that was not designed for that function, and that maintenance doctrine would have prohibited me from using that way. It worked, or it worked well enough. The connection was clean on 3 of 5 test cycles, which was not the standard I preferred but was the standard available. I told Price it was ready. He looked at me for a moment, confidence level Chief. Tube 4, I'd say 70% the guidance holds for the full run. The connection is solid. The component is not what the spec calls for, but it'll carry the signal. If it drops, it'll drop early and the torpedo runs ballistic, which in our approach geometry means it still hits inside the general target area, just not the precise point. And a ballistic hit at that point in the sequence. At that point in the sequence, we'd have already done the prep work. A ballistic hit at the target node with the medium already altered, it adds to the effect. Less precise but not wasted. Price nodded. Tube 4 stays in the sequence. I went back to the engine room. We were 2 hours from the firing solution being finalized when Rodriguez called me back to the con. Not urgency in her voice. She never communicated urgency directly. It wasn't her style, but a particular quality of quiet that I'd learned to read as something you should see immediately. The colony was moving. Not structurally, not the whole colony relocating, which would have been impossible given its size, but the growth pattern along the outer edges of the node structure was changing. The acoustic signatures at the perimeter were shifting. Something was happening along the margins of the colony that hadn't been happening an hour before. "Is it aware of us?" Price asked. Rodriguez considered this carefully. "I don't know what awareness means for what we're looking at. What I can tell you is that the activity pattern change correlates with our arrival in this position. We've been stationary for 4 hours. The colony is doing something different at its margins than it was doing before we got here." "Defense," Thompson said. "It doesn't look like a defense response in the sense of it orienting toward us. It looks more like," she searched for the word, "fortification. It's building faster along the node margins, reinforcing the density of the critical node." We looked at each other. "How much time before the reinforcement affects our firing solution?" Price asked. "If the growth rate stays consistent, 6 hours before the node density increases enough to require recalculating the sequence. 10 hours before the sequence stops being viable at all. We're 2 hours from finalizing the firing solution." "Yes." "Then we finalize it in 2 hours and we execute," Price said. "Thompson, what's our status on Tube 4? "Ready, sir." "O'Neill." "Engine room is ready, sir. I'll need 20 minutes to get drive configured for the post-launch sprint." "You have them, let's get to work." I went back to the engine room and spent the 20 minutes not just configuring the drive, but telling the plant what I was going to need from it. That's how it feels, after enough years in the same space, not that you're operating machinery, but that you're in dialogue with it, understanding what it can give and what it absolutely cannot, finding the margins where you can push harder than the spec allows, and the margins where pushing harder will cost you something you can't afford to lose. The reactor was the foundation of everything. The reactor had to hold through the shockwave return. If it didn't, we were finished, at 4,000 feet, in water that was cold and getting colder. The plant told me it would hold. Not in words, obviously. In numbers, in the readings that a man who has been doing this long enough learns to read the way a farmer reads weather. I believed it. "Con, engine room is ready," I said over the intercom. "Copy engine room," Price's voice. "Approach to firing position helm 1/2 ahead." We moved. The final approach to firing position took 40 minutes. The Dallas was quiet. I mean quiet in the submarine sense. Everyone doing exactly their job and nothing else. No conversation beyond what the work required. The kind of quiet that a good crew achieves under pressure. It's a difficult thing to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. It's not silence. It's focused, directed attention. Every mind in the boat bent on the same problem from their particular angle. Nobody carrying anything extra. Rodriguez tracked the colony's outer margin changes throughout the approach. The fortification she'd identified was continuing. The growth rate at the node edges was elevated compared to baseline. Whatever the colony was doing in response to our presence, it had concluded that the node margins needed to be stronger. It was making our job harder. We were about to make the job irrelevant. Price brought us to firing depth, shallower than our survey position, a compromise worked out with painstaking care between our approach geometry and the safety calculations for a full salvo at depth. Not close to the surface. No one had suggested close to the surface, but shallower than 4,000 feet, because the shockwave return from 8 torpedoes detonating in sequence at that depth, in that geology, was going to be significant, and we needed to be moving before it arrived. "Con firing solution is confirmed," Rodriguez said. "All 8 tubes sequenced, intervals as programmed." "Weapons," Price said. "Status." "All tubes ready, sir. Guidance confirmed on tubes 1 through 3, 5 through 8. Tube 4 showing 70% confidence on guidance as briefed." "Understood." A pause. "Open outer doors." The sound of the outer doors opening at depth is distinctive, a mechanical percussion that you feel more than hear. I felt it in the engine room. Outer doors open, sir. Stand by to fire on my mark. Another pause, shorter, fire. The first torpedo left the tube with a pressure change that popped my ears despite the insulation. 1 second, and then the second. The boat shuddered with each launch, not dramatically, not violently, but with the honest physical reality of significant mass being accelerated by hydraulic pressure. 7 more times. 7 more shudders. The rhythm of it was almost regular, interrupted only slightly by the interval between tubes 3 and 4, while the guidance confirmation ran its final check. Tube 4 fired. The guidance held, as far as we could tell from the brief telemetry before the torpedo cleared our active range. Silence. Not true silence. The plant was running. The ambient noise of mechanical systems was present. Rodriguez's instruments were active. But the particular silence that falls after you have done the thing you can do, and now the outcome is outside your hands. 23 seconds, approximately, for the torpedoes to reach target at the run distance we'd calculated. I watched the reactor gauges, watched the coolant flow readings, watched the secondary loop temperature, which was still elevated and was about to have company from a very different source. The first detonation registered as a pressure change, a faint, faraway thump that arrived through the water before the actual shockwave. A warning. I braced. Then the world changed. The first shockwave from the colony detonation hit the Dallas at a magnitude I do not have a clean reference for. It was not like any collision, any hard maneuver, any emergency drill. It was as if the ocean itself had decided to move the boat, not push it, not strike it, but simply decide it was in a different position now. The Dallas moved approximately 90 feet to starboard in what felt like a single instant. The motion was accompanied by a sound I can only describe as the boat speaking, groaning, cracking. The voices of metal under load that you never want to hear, but that you learn to interpret after enough time in the deep. Lights went out. Red emergency lighting came on. 3 alarms sounded in the engine room simultaneously. I was already moving before I fully registered what the alarms were. 22 years of trained reflex. The first alarm is the primary coolant pressure spike. The second is the bus under voltage. The third is the auxiliary cooling system. I hit the primary coolant first because it's the reactor alarm and you handle reactor alarms before anything else. It was a pressure spike from the shock. The rapid lateral acceleration had created a transient in the coolant system that the automatic controls weren't fast enough to catch. I caught it manually, bled the excess, confirmed stable. The bus under voltage was from the shock to the power distribution panel. A connector had shaken loose. I found it by feel in the red light and reseated it. Power restored. 2 alarms down. The third alarm was the pipe. I heard it before I reached the panel, the very specific sound of pressurized water finding a gap in something that had been whole a moment ago. A fitting in the auxiliary cooling line had cracked, a clean fracture along an old weld that had been waiting for an excuse. Water under pressure, cold and significant, misting into the engine room air. I put my hands on the fitting. This is not in any manual. This is what you do when you're the only person in the space and the patch kit is on the other side of the room, and your boat is in the middle of a shockwave sequence, and you cannot afford to lose cooling to the secondary loop. You put your hands on the fracture, and you hold it while you figure out what's next. The second shockwave hit while I was on the floor, one hand on the pipe, the other reaching for the emergency kit that had slid 3 feet away in the first wave. This shockwave was different in character, smaller absolute force, but arriving from a shifted angle, which meant the Dallas rolled instead of translated. 42 degrees of roll, I found out later. At the time, what I knew was that everything that wasn't secured was now a projectile, and several things that were secured were reconsidering their commitment. The corner of an equipment rack found my knee. I heard something in the knee that I didn't want to hear, and I filed it under things to deal with later and found the patch kit. The third wave was smaller, the fourth barely registered. I was already working by then, the patch applied, the coolant flow nominal, the secondary loop restored. The reactor was clean. The drive plant was asking nothing of me that I wasn't already giving it. My voice on the intercom. Engine room is functional, reactor plant stable, we have full drive. Price's voice, which was steady. Copy, Chief, good to hear you. Helm all ahead full, clear the target area. We moved. It took 10 minutes to clear the immediate blast radius and bring the Dallas to a position where Rodriguez could get clean readings without interference from the turbulence behind us. 10 minutes of full drive, the plant giving everything I'd asked of it, the boat responding the way a good boat responds, not perfectly, because perfect isn't available at depth with a cracked pipe fitting and a con that had taken damage, but well, adequately, exactly enough. Rodriguez had her headphones on before we stopped maneuvering. She was listening to the rift. I came forward from the engine room. Danby was at her station with a cloth pressed to her forehead, a laceration from the first wave, clean, already controlled, the kind of injury you acknowledge and then work through. Thompson was at the weapons console with his left hand splinted in what appeared to be a tongue depressor and a strip of electrical tape. He'd done it himself, which was very Thompson. Gupta was running navigation checks, confirming our position, doing the job. Price was standing at the center of the con, looking at Rodriguez's back. Rodriguez was very still. Nobody spoke. She pulled the headphones off slowly. She turned to face us. Her expression was the one people have when they have seen something large and irreversible and have not yet finished deciding how to feel about it. The venting pattern has changed, she said. Her voice was controlled. The primary node where the critical target was, the acoustic signature is gone. The structural integrity has failed. She stopped, breathed. The adjacent nodes, I can hear it happening. Structural failure propagating. The colony material along the rift margin is collapsing. She looked at Price. The cascade is working, sir. No one said anything for a moment. Current patterns? Price asked. Not yet. The collapse is still ongoing. It'll take time before the water column settles enough to show circulation. Days, maybe longer, but the blockage is gone. She looked at her instruments, then back at Price. The rift is breathing again, sir. Price looked at the plotting table. He looked at the chart that showed the position of the Dallas against the geography of the rift, the coordinates of the colony, the vast deep ocean context of what we had just done. Helm, he said, make your depth 100 feet, take us up. We went up. I went back to the engine room and sat down on an equipment case and looked at my hands for a while. They were shaking, which was normal. There was blood on the right one from a gash I hadn't noticed, which was also probably normal under the circumstances. The knee was starting to communicate its displeasure now that the adrenaline was standing down. The pipe patch held. The reactor was clean. The drive plant was running the way it should, asking nothing extraordinary of me. I sat there for a long time. The engine room at depth makes particular sounds, the hum of the plant, the circulation of coolant, the low mechanical voice of systems under steady load. After 11 years, it's the sound of a room I know better than any room I've ever lived in. More familiar than the house I grew up in. More familiar than any apartment I've rented between deployments. I let it be around me the way you let a familiar room be around you when you need to not be thinking. It didn't entirely work. Nothing entirely works. I thought about the colony. It had been alive, in whatever way things alive at that depth and pressure and timescale are alive. It had been building, accreting structure from the mineral-rich water, constructing something that served its needs across periods of time that made our concept of patience look like impatience. It had not chosen us as an adversary. It had not known we existed in any category that mattered to it. We were surface phenomena, surface temperature creatures, utterly irrelevant to the deep-pressure geothermal world it inhabited. I tried to understand it the way I try to understand machines. Not emotionally, functionally. What did it need? What was it optimizing for? Was there something within the distributed processing of its colony body that constituted preference or satisfaction, or the particular quality of attention that could reasonably be called thought? Had it experienced anything in the 23 seconds between the first detonation and the cascade that constituted knowing it was ending? I didn't know. I couldn't know. The honest answer is that the gap between what I can understand and what that kind of life actually is may be too large to bridge from this side. I'm a man who grew up in Ohio, who learned engines in the Navy, who has a specific and limited set of tools for understanding the world. The colony had none of those reference points, and I had none of its reference points, and somewhere in that mutual incomprehension is the shape of what happened down there. Until we weren't irrelevant. That's the moment that sits with me. Whatever indifference the colony had maintained towards surface life, if indifference is even the right category, that ended when our torpedoes entered the water. In the last moments, did it experience something we'd recognize as alarm, confusion, the recognition that something had arrived from the impossible brightness above and brought destruction? I hope not, if I'm being honest. I hope the deep-pressure geothermal version of death is as quiet and undramatic as the geological processes that had built the colony across centuries. I hope there was nothing it would call pain, and nothing it would call fear. I carry enough already. I thought about the 3 men we'd lost in the forward compartment. The damage report had come in during the post-sprint assessment, during the transit to shallower depth, and Price had given me the names privately, quietly, in the engine room. He came down specifically for that. He sat across from me the way he'd sat across from me during the Chesapeake conversation, and he said the names, and I said them back to confirm I'd heard them right, and then we were quiet together for a minute. Good men. Men I'd worked alongside in the specific intimacy of submarine service, which is an intimacy unlike the kind you choose. It's the intimacy of shared small spaces and shared danger and shared purpose across years. The kind where you know a person's technical competence and their irritating habits and their genuine worth in the detailed involuntary way that proximity enforces. The kind of men you don't replace. You get new people, and the new people become their own known quantities over time, and eventually you have a new crew. But you don't replace the ones you lose. They stay at a specific size in your memory, neither diminishing nor growing, just present, carried. They go with you. I don't lose sleep over the decision to fire. I want to be clear about that in whatever record this becomes, for whatever authority reads it or doesn't read it. The math was not complicated. Hundreds of millions of dead in the first winter, by the conservative models that Dr. Woods's team had been running since the first reports. Hundreds of millions more in the second winter, and the third, and the starvation and infrastructure collapse, and the cascading failures that come when you remove the climate foundation that human civilization has been building on for 10,000 years. Against 3 men I respected enormously, and against the colony, which had not chosen any of this and did not know it was party to a conflict, and which was nevertheless the direct mechanical cause of a planetary catastrophe that would have killed more people than most wars in history combined. The math was not complicated. The math was brutal and clear and correct. I stand by it. I would stand by it in any forum, in front of any authority, under any examination, from this moment until whatever moment is my last. I still carry those 3 names. That's not contradiction. That's just what it costs, and I owe it to them to pay the cost in full and not pretend it doesn't exist. We made contact with the surface 8 hours after the attack, once we'd confirmed the Dallas could maintain depth safely, and the communication systems were checked through. Encrypted burst transmission, full data package, everything Rodriguez had recorded from the approach through the post-attack acoustic survey. The crisis team at the Pentagon had been watching through whatever remote sensor networks they still had operational, and the data we sent confirmed what they were already seeing. The colony structures along the primary node were gone. The secondary nodes were failing. The rift was venting in a pattern consistent with its pre-blockage baseline. Dr. Woods sent a message directly to Price. I didn't read it, it wasn't addressed to me, but I was in the con when he read it to himself, alone, standing at the plotting table with the printout in his hand. He read it slowly, which Price didn't usually do with text. Then he folded it and put it in his pocket and stood there for a long time looking at the chart. Later, I asked Rodriguez what she thought the message said. She said she didn't know. I believe her. Rodriguez doesn't speculate about things she doesn't know. The models, we learned eventually, showed full circulation restoration in 8 to 12 months. Northern Hemisphere temperature stabilization in 18 to 24. Not fast. Not clean. Not a return to the world as it had been on the day before the earthquake. That world was gone. The cold snap had taken its toll in human and economic and infrastructural terms that would require years to assess and longer to address. But not the end. Not the long freeze, the ice age. The death of everything above 40 degrees latitude. Recovery. The word felt enormous and insufficient simultaneously. We came home to a world that was colder than we'd left it, but warming again by fractions of a degree, measurable only on instruments, a trend line that looked like hope if you were committed to reading it that way. The ports were congested with vessels that had been rerouted during the crisis and hadn't sorted themselves out. The cities in the north had visible damage from the cold snap, not the ice age damage the models had projected, but real damage. Infrastructure not built for temperatures that dropped that fast and that far, pipes that burst, power grids that faltered, the thousand small failures that attend a large, sudden environmental change. The death toll from the cold snap itself was significant. I saw estimates later, in news reports and official assessments, and I read them the way you read things that are large enough to be abstract, but that at some level you're trying not to access, represent real people in real places who died in real cold. I read them and I remembered those 3 names from the forward compartment, and I tried to hold both things in my head at once, the scale of what was prevented and the cost of what was lost, and find a way to carry them together that didn't require me to lie to myself. I haven't entirely succeeded. I'm still working on it. Price wrote commendations for the full crew. Rodriguez received recognition I'm not authorized to discuss in detail. Thompson's finger healed, crooked, and he wore it like a flag. Gupta applied for officer candidate school and Price endorsed the application without hesitation, and with what I understand was a personal note that the selection board found either moving or slightly embarrassing, depending on which member of the board you asked. Danby transferred to a surface posting. She told me it was for personal reasons, wanting to be closer to family. I believed her. I also believed that 4,000 feet was a depth she'd taken something from and wanted distance from for a while. That's legitimate. That's a person knowing what they need. Me, I'm still in the engine room. Different boat now. The Dallas went into an extended maintenance cycle after the debrief, the kind of thorough going over that follows any operation that pushed the structural integrity the way ours did. I transferred to her sister ship while the work was done. Same basic layout. Different particular personality, because every boat has a personality if you pay enough attention. The secondary coolant loop on this boat runs slightly warm. I'm watching it. The deep Atlantic rift is breathing again, down in the darkness where nothing we built reaches. The thermohaline circulation is running slowly, not at full historical volume, recovering in the way large systems recover from large disruptions, by increments and over time. The northern hemisphere is warming by fractions of a degree per month, trending the right direction. Somewhere down there in the ruins of the colony, in the structures that collapsed when the cascade ran its course, there may be something still alive. The colony was vast and distributed and patient. I don't know how much of it survived. I don't know what survival means for something like that, whether it goes on in some diminished form, whether it rebuilds, whether it has any mechanism at all for understanding what happened to it. I think about that sometimes. I think about 8 kilometers of living structure built across geological time, and what it is to have that ended in 23 seconds by a firing solution improvised in a submarine con by 6 people with borrowed mathematics, and a guidance system held together by a non-standard splice connection. I think about the 43% probability estimate that I didn't share with the crew. I think we got lucky in all the ways that luck operates. The splice held, the sequence worked, the cascade ran as the models predicted, and the Dallas absorbed 2 major shockwaves without losing the systems that mattered. Any one of those could have gone differently. Any one of them, if it had gone differently, would have changed the outcome in ways that I don't let myself follow to their conclusions. But they didn't go differently. They went the way they went. The way they went was enough. That's the only thing I've found in all the time since that actually holds up. Not heroism, not exceptionalism, not the comfortable story where humanity confronts the impossible and wins decisively. The comfortable story would be dishonest, and the 3 names I carry would deserve better than to be footnotes in a story about how great we are. What holds up is this. 6 people were given an impossible problem and a set of inadequate tools and a margin of hours inside which the problem had to be solved. And they solved it, not because they were the best available, though they were good. Not because the tools were adequate, because the tools were not. Because when you have nothing else left, when the comfortable options are exhausted, and the margin is real and the weight is fully understood, there is something in the particular human that simply does not stop. Not heroism, not exceptionalism, something older and less comfortable, the refusal to die on someone else's schedule, the inability, when faced with the specific size of what will be lost, to accept that it will be lost, the willingness to hold a cracked pipe together with bare hands in a rolling submarine and figure out what comes next because someone has to and you happen to be the one in the space. I think about the old chief on my first boat, the one who showed me the splice configuration in Norfolk in 2009. He was showing off for the junior enlisted, demonstrating a non-standard repair technique as a kind of bar trick. Look what I can make this system do. He probably forgot it the next day. He certainly never imagined that the junior petty officer paying attention in the back of the group would carry that knowledge through 11 years of submarine service to a moment at 4,000 feet in the Atlantic, when a standard guidance component had developed a microfracture and 8 torpedoes needed to leave their tubes in sequence, and every one of them needed to count. That's how it works in the end, not through grand strategy or exceptional genius, but through the accumulation of small knowledge passed from person to person across time, through the patient act of paying attention when someone else is talking, through the willingness to stay in the space when it gets difficult and keep working the problem. The old chief is retired now, living somewhere in Virginia, I'm told, doing what retired chiefs do. He doesn't know what that lesson was worth. I've thought about finding him and telling him. I haven't yet. I might. It seems like something a person should know. They built across geological time. They were vast and patient and distributed, and had been alive in the deep dark since before we had names for anything. Since before we had fire, since before any of what we call civilization existed in any form. They were, by any rational measure of scale and duration, the senior presence in the Atlantic. We had 22 years and a non-standard splice, and 6 people who refused to run out of ideas before they ran out of torpedoes. We were exactly enough. We were here, we still are. The secondary coolant loop on this new boat runs slightly warm. I'm watching it. I always watch it. That will have to be sufficient.